What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and if you're enjoying the content here on my channel, then make sure you hit the like button and make sure you hit subscribe so you can help decide what direction the content on my channel goes in the foreseeable future. Alright, so one of the big questions that I've had, and this is probably a video I'm going to release before we really jump into Christmas, but one of the big requests that I've had is to make a video with Daken related content. At least I'm pretty sure that's how you pronounce it. I'm pretty sure it's Daken. Maybe it's Daken, I don't know. I was half inclined to call him Steve. Oh, that'd be an amazing title for a video. Steve, the son of Wolverine. Wolverine had a son named Steve. It's like, yeah, man, he's just a tax guy. That's all he does is just do taxes. He didn't really have anything special going on. He's just kind of just hanging out. And then he screwed up Wolverine's taxes one day, so we killed him. But in any event, I've been getting that request a lot. A lot of people really like the character of Daken. Now, Daken, as you guys know him, was really kind of fleshed out in Daniel Way's run of Wolverine Origins, which is this 50-issue run that just covers all these missing memories of Wolverine's life, as well as Original Sin and subsequent stories that came around during that time. But he was originally introduced under Jeff Loeb in Wolverine Volume 3, issue number 54, I think. I'm not going to swear to that, but I'm pretty sure it's the case, somewhere around there, somewhere along those lines. But instead of jumping into a whole volume of Wolverine and covering all these things that lead up to the introduction of Daken, only to turn around and see a flop because nobody really cares, what I instead wanted to do here was basically go through and do the what if story where Wolverine killed his son. Now, what this does is this basically kind of wraps around into the early days of his life, and it turns history on its head a little bit. And what I mean here is this story was written by a guy named Rob Williams. Now, as far as I know, Rob Williams really just kind of delved into independent comics. He really did a lot of indie stuff, and he's only really done a handful of Marvel comics, and I think right now he's working with DC and Vertigo. But the idea here was that when Daken's backstory was slowly revealed over the course of a series of publications, it had been established that his birth came by way of a massacre, to be honest. The Winter Soldier, Bucky Barnes, had basically been sent to kill the pregnant wife of Wolverine. He succeeded in doing that while Wolverine was gone, and then Daken was basically taken from the corpse of his mother and then dropped off at a wealthy family's house. And that was really kind of the earliest days of Daken. That's how he kind of grew into that. What this story does is it says that didn't happen. Instead, Wolverine basically came home while Itsu was being attacked. She did die, but then he absolutely slaughtered Bucky Barnes. This is kind of a crazy situation because Rob Williams in his writing, it's kind of weird. I wouldn't say it's continuity errors so much that because this is a what if story, this is not the same set of events. So what I mean here is, for those of you guys who are new to Marvel Comics, what ifs are usually an alternate reality. DC has Elseworlds where it's just here's a story where Batman and the Justice League become Green Lanterns, but they're not tied into the main DC continuity. It's not like the Ring of Abin-Sur went to Bruce Wayne instead of Hal Jordan, and that's the continuity. It happens that way, but it's not tied into things. With Marvel's What If, they tied into the main continuity. So they say, well, things progress normally, and then, this event happened. And that seems to be what happens here. But the idea of Wolverine killing Bucky Barnes is kind of a big deal because Wolverine fought alongside Steve Rogers, Captain America in World War II. He fought alongside Bucky Barnes as well. And so he's basically killing an ally that he fought with during World War II. The problem with this is that for Wolverine, it's pretty easy to distance himself from the idea of I'm killing a friend, because this is after the supposed death of Bucky Barnes when he was taken by the Russians and transformed into the assassin known as the Winter Soldier. So because of this, the memories that he had of his former life are essentially gone. Not only that, Bucky Barnes had never really faced an enemy like Wolverine before, and that's prevalent in this story when he's just you're not supposed to be here, and he's terrified for his life because Wolverine is a guy that after his claws first popped, after he took off from his family and he basically tried to live a peaceful life, it was one of these things where he just wanted to stay out of the public eye. He was like the Hulk. He just wanted to be left alone. He wanted a peaceful life. But woe betide the poor soul that came along and screwed that up. And that's what happened with Bucky Barnes. He took the wrong contract. And the result is that Wolverine basically decapitates him. Now from here, the tough thing for Logan is that he literally has to cut his wife open and take Daken out. And that's where things start to differentiate, because in the main stories, and again, I'm not going to get too deep into this on the off chance that this video is stupidly popular and people want me to do Daken, but essentially the story unfolded in a different way to where an enigmatic being basically came along. Some guy that we didn't know who it was at first came along and took Daken out of his mother's body and then dropped him off at a family. And so with Wolverine taking him, for him, this is a crushing experience for Logan. And this changes everything about his character. I mean, this will impact his role in the X-Men, the whole 9 yards, because now he's basically a father. And that was really Daniel Way's emphasis. When he said, okay, let's focus more on Daken, let's flesh his character out, almost the entirety of Wolverine Origins was this idea of Wolverine basically reflecting on the history of his life. And then I think by issue number 10, Daken popped up and he was like, oh my God, I'm a father. And he had to basically change his ways. And that's what happens here. He looks back at his life, a life of violence, basically, living for the enjoyment of it. Sure, he killed people, but he also wanted a peaceful life. But it was the idea that Wolverine could afford to be selfish. He was, for all intents and purposes, immortal. And so he knew in the back of his head, even if he didn't want to acknowledge it, that if Itsu had a child and the two of them raised it, a time would come that if that child did not inherit his healing factor, he would outlive both his wife and his son. But for Wolverine, that wasn't the issue. It was he just wants to have a normal life. He just wants to have a family. He wants to be as human as he possibly can. But looking at this child, he basically sits down and says, I can't just live for myself anymore. It can't just be me anymore. Now I've got someone that looks up to me. I effectively have to cast off my old ways, and I literally just need to run to the furthest corners of the world. And that's what they do. They run to Tibet. They run to the third of the world, and they essentially just kind of hide out there. Now, the reason why Tibet was chosen is because it's such a difficult place to get to. You've got to get through the Himalayas, assuming you can survive the experience, and then you've got to find your way to where it is that they are in Tibet. And so because of the fact that it's so isolated and so hidden, the likelihood of anybody who had grudges with Wolverine, Lady Deathstrike, any of those characters, Nuke, Sabretooth, the likelihood of any of them finding Wolverine is slim to none. And so during this time, he basically raises his son as best he can. He teaches him prayer. He teaches him the humble nature of life. He teaches him to respect life, to respect the value of all living things, to very much be at home with himself. The problem with this is that Wolverine is effectively ignoring what it was that made him who he was. And this is why Rob Williams' writing is so good, is because it begs the question, is the violent nature of Wolverine just a part of who he is? Is it just his nature to be violent? There's a really, really good parable that I heard once called The Scorpion and the Frog. And any of you guys who have heard this, bear with me for a second because a lot of people haven't, but it really represents these opposing dichotomies of Wolverine's desire for peace and Wolverine's inherent violence. The parable goes like this. One day, there was a scorpion sitting on the side of a riverbank one day, and it was trying to figure out how to get across. And a frog happened by. And the scorpion said, frog, let me climb on your back and you can set across the river and you can drop me off on the other side. And the frog said, no. If I do that, you'll sting me and I'll drown. And the scorpion said, well, why would I do that? If I did that, then we would both drown. And the frog thought about it for a minute, and the frog said, well, that's a really good point. Yeah, okay, that's cool. So the scorpion climbs on the frog's back, and the frog sets off. Well, halfway across the river, the scorpion's tail rears up and stings the frog. And while the frog's veins are filling up with venom, it looks back at the scorpion and it said, why did you sting me? Now we'll both drown. And the scorpion said, I can't help it. It's in my nature. And that's the crazy thing about the story, is because it's essentially this example where Wolverine's violent nature is who he is. It's a fundamental part of who he is. To ignore that, to try to put it in a box and hide it away in a closet means that he's not recognizing the warning signs initially that his son may be moving in that direction. Now, by the time he begins to pick these up, it's too late. And the way that we learn that is they're tending to their farm. There's of course a goat that they're going to take care of and so on and so forth. But when Wolverine goes inside, he asks his son, he says, what happened to the goat? And he says, well, it seems like a predator got to it. And that's when Wolverine begins to realize that his son Daken is moving towards this direction of being such a violent individual, basically following the same path that Wolverine himself followed when he was younger. Now from here, we transition to the introduction of Charles Xavier. And so this is Rob Williams saying, hey, even if I don't give you a definitive chronology of when these events take place in terms of what's going on in the outside world, here's some measure of how things take place. And so it works out really well because the story is supposed to be isolated. In truth, this whole first half is supposed to be removed from all the events that are going on. And so we're not supposed to have this tried and true understanding of when this chronology takes place. But when Xavier shows up, of course, Wolverine's like, oh my God, there's somebody here, because his first thoughts flash back to Weapon X, all that kind of good stuff. And so he says, you got to go, get out of here. You got to go. And Charles Xavier essentially offers him a chance to become part of the X-Men. Now, as we know, with regards to the history of the X-Men and my explanation on the X-Men team and so on and so forth, which I need to get back into character and team explanations. But when Charles Xavier showed up, this was after the original X-Men of Iceman and Beast, Archangel, Jean Grey, and Cyclops had been taken prisoner by the living island of Krakoa. And so this is essentially Xavier assembling a new team with Colossus, Nightcrawler, the whole nine yards, in order to rescue the original X-Men team, which is where that X-Men title under Chris Claremont began to grow from. But unlike the main Earth 616 continuity, where Wolverine says, okay, yeah, sure, I'll join that. Instead, he's like, get out of here, go away. I do not want the outside world interfering. Now, the crazy thing about this is his son, of course, asks him, says, who was that man? What's going on? Wolverine muses to himself. He says, well, maybe I should have told him it's a man from another life. Maybe I should have told him it's a guy from the outside world that leads a school where he wants to raise people that have abilities to make sure their abilities are used adequately. This is really Wolverine with an extreme amount of hubris, because instead of sitting down and saying, well, maybe this guy Charles Xavier knows what he's talking about. Maybe the Xavier School for Gifted Youngsters, maybe that's a place that Daken needs to go to, because maybe being among his his own peers will help him to better understand his own role. If there's a yin and a yang, if he's not around people that don't have healing factors and that don't have advanced combat skills and that don't have claws, then it gives him this sort of false sense of how strong he is. But if he is around people that are just as capable as he is, that could simply just shut down his mind instead of fighting, then it helps him to understand his place, because this is really what Daken is experiencing right now. Like all teenagers, all of us growing up, we're trying to understand where we reside in this hierarchy of this social food chain. We're trying to figure out if we're alpha males, beta males. We're trying to figure out if we're alpha females, beta females. We're trying to figure out where we stand when it comes to our place in the bigger picture. But Daken has no real challengers. It's almost like he's a predator in a world of prey. And so because of this, when we pick up 2 years later and he ends up in a monastery, yes, they're formidable in their own right. He's told, by the other kids around there, they're extremely capable in terms of fighting, but Daken doesn't take any of them seriously because he has claws, because he has a healing factor. He could kill every last one of these guys, no questions asked. He might sustain a few bruises, but his healing factor will take care of all that. And so there's no counterbalance here. There's no one to challenge his superiority. And so it's grown to the point where he has a very superior sense of self. Now, this comes to a head when he begins talking to a woman named Indira. Now, there's another kid that steps up, and this kid, Dorji, I think is how you pronounce it. I'm not sure exactly how to pronounce that right. But he basically says, no, Indira, you do not have to kowtow to this guy. You don't have to do whatever it is that he wants you to do. We'll keep you protected. And so what happens is Daken challenges this dude. And of course, we end up picking up with this kind of montage where Rob Williams bounces back and forth, where Wolverine takes off for a time and he tells his son, you're not to leave the property, you're to tend the land, do your chores. If I find out you've done anything other, there's going to be hell to pay when I get back. But we also learn that during this fight, really Daken had beat this kid within an inch of his life. Not only that, he had dished out some severe physical injuries in terms of cuts and so on and so forth. Now, this is Rob Williams unofficially telling us Daken has the use of his claws, because up until this point, we didn't really know. I mean, we didn't know if those had manifested at all. And it's kind of cool that it happens behind the scenes. It's also kind of interesting the first use of his claws here are in a very violent conflict, at least as far as we know. But because of all this, people are terrified of him. People are horrified of him. And this comes to fruition when, we really have Daken just kind of hanging out on the side of a mountain. And then Indira comes to see him and says, everybody wants you guys to leave. They're terrified of you. They're horrified of you. They see you as a violent, insane, psychopathic animal, and they're afraid you're going to kill everyone. And so the only way for them to cope with that is to ask you to leave. And so, he initially says, I don't really want to, but in the midst of their discussion, they're suddenly met with the arrival of Sabretooth. Now, again, Sabretooth in this story is just as much a physical as a metaphorical representation of Wolverine's sins coming back to haunt him. And the reason why I say that is because Sabretooth being a physical presence has always been a part of Wolverine's life for as long as he can remember, going back to his time as Team X, so on and so forth. Not only that, Sabretooth is just pure bloodlust. I mean, Sabretooth just loves killing people. He has no real connection with his own humanity, and so he has no real connection with anybody else's humanity. And because of this, of course, the first thing he does is cast Indira aside and send her flying off the side of the mountain to her death. But then he turns and looks to Daken and says, I'm trying to get Wolverine, but I can smell him on you. I can tell you are his offspring. And so he says the best way to get to him is to get to you. Now, Daken fights off as best he can, and he's actually pretty impressive here. It's actually pretty cool to see him hold his own to a degree against Sabretooth, but what he's doing is he's basically fighting experience. He's fighting a guy that has a vast amount of experience in all forms of combat. And so try as he might, he's really got nothing against Sabretooth, which of course leads to the return of Wolverine, who steps in. Now, again, this is really kind of a funny situation, but the issue with this is that where Wolverine is successfully able to basically kill Sabretooth, or at least it seems like it here, we basically jump forward a bit to what Daken was doing. Now, Rob Williams does not give us like this in-depth explanation. Instead, he just kind of fast tracks it all. Then he tells us that, following the death of Indira, Daken had basically gone to the monk monastery and slaughtered them all. And this was effectively his downward spiral, because in every story, that's what happens, right? I mean, when you have like a villain, or you have like a villain who is a good guy at some point in time, there's always that Darth Vader effect. There's a point where they stop being a good guy and they start being a bad guy. Sometimes it takes a long time for that transition to happen, but that switch eventually takes place. And this is the switch for Daken. This is where he stops being Anakin and becomes Darth Vader. This is where he stops being the son of, Wolverine and becomes a bad guy. And so because of this, he basically takes off to Tokyo 9 years after all this had happened and forms a criminal empire for himself, to the point where he basically has anything he wanted to. Now, he built this empire through fear, blood, and death, but he was able to build it nonetheless. The problem with this is that once Wolverine finally locates Daken after tracking him down for so long, he says, look, I'm going to offer you the opportunity to stand down. Like, you have to give up here. You have to stop this, come back home with me, live a life of peace. We can leave all this behind us and we can call it a day. What's ironic about this is Wolverine's still not learning. He's still not learning the fact that you just can't run away. You can't run away from your problems. You got to face them head on. Daken is a representation of Wolverine's failures. Daken is a representation of the fact that Wolverine believed he could take his darker nature, put it in a corner, and act like it didn't exist. It's everything that Wolverine about his youth coming back to haunt him. And so because of this, Daken lashes out, and Wolverine responds in kind by saying, "I brought a Muramasa blade." Now, for those of you guys who are new to Marvel Comics, there are several different aspects, several different weapons that can defeat people who have healing factors. Carbonadium can disrupt healing factors temporarily, but it's really more like putting healing factors in a state of flux so much as turning them off. The Muramasa blade turns off healing factors temporarily. And so when a person is touched by a Muramasa blade, their healing factor essentially stops working for a temporary amount of time, effectively making them human. They can be killed by any normal conventional means. Now, when it comes to people who have healing factors, the caveat is that unless you were to like cut off their head, or unless you were to remove their heart or something like that, do something that would basically keep their body from functioning in a normal capacity, they're always going to come back after the effects of the Muramasa blade wear off. Now, we do not see that to its fruition here. Instead, Rob Williams effectively kind of cuts it off with the idea that Wolverine was forced to kill his son. But this is really Wolverine finally recognizing, it's him finally learning that the mistakes that he made in his life, the things that he screwed up, were an indication of the fact that he was a guy that could never find peace. Wolverine could never live the life that he was hoping for. He wanted a kid, he wanted a life of happiness, he wanted to be left alone, but the mistakes that he made, the things that he'd done, were always going to come back to haunt him. They were always going to be a part of his life. And ultimately, Daken was a representation of the fact that Wolverine, again, cannot have a regular, normal, average life like a human. He was born a killer and he will die a killer. And that's just how his life exists. But if you guys are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and yeah, leave a comment down below. Let me know whether or not you guys are interested in more Daken stuff, and I will catch you all later. Peace.